Thank you. Thank you so much, Mikhail, and thank you, Bernardo, for the very kind invitation. We have a great lineup of speakers, and I'm sure we are all looking forward to hearing from them. So let me be very brief. I think this panel is an interesting as well as challenging one. The idea behind it is to go beyond a discussion about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and now that conflict may end. I think we all hope Ukraine will prevail and will be able to repel the invasion that took place a year ago. But the idea of this panel is to go perhaps a step or a few steps further and discuss what peace may look like, not just in Ukraine, but beyond. We talked a lot about definitions of peace yesterday when the report was presented. Peace can take different forms. Peace may also be, may not always be a just peace. And I think, the panel we have today gives us an opportunity to look into a concept that has kind of disappeared, right, from the policy debate, as all of us have concentrated on the dynamics of the war, the security needs that the war has created, not just for Ukraine, but also for countries in Europe and beyond. We have all moved into this mode of ramping up our defenses. There's an unprecedented investment in defense across Europe and beyond. And the panel today gives us an opportunity, even as we are still in the middle of this conflict, and we're probably days, if not hours away from another acute phase of the conflict, to look a little bit beyond and see how the European peace project itself may evolve, may develop as a result of the conflict we are seeing in Europe. For doing that, we have, as I said, a great lineup of speakers. I would start with Professor Sergey RADCHENKO, who is known to many of you. He's a professor here at SAIS. He's a Cold War historian. He knows the history of the conflict very well. You have 5 to 7 minutes, and then I will move to the other speakers. Thank you again.
Thank you, Emiliano. Let me also use my credentials, I suppose, as a SAIS professor to welcome you all here at SAIS. Thank you all for being here. Really delighted to see such a good crowd, and thank you for organizing this. Certainly very, very important topic. 5 to 7 minutes to talk about prospects of peace. That is a very challenging prospect in itself. But let me do this. Let me try to present to you my view on how I think we end up in conflict. And in order to do this, I will do something very unusual for panels like this. I participate in many panels. I never do this the first time, so we'll see. I will draw a graph. I can actually do that because I teach in this room, so I know that this opens up and there's a board there. So I will draw a graph for you to try to explain what I think, where I think we are. The other way.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I don't want to pose any. Okay. So there's a pen here. This is what it looks like. This is where we are. Okay. This is kind of a graph. Okay. Let's call this a slippery slope L. Why is it slippery? Because it goes down, you slide down. Yeah, there's a certain dynamic. Once you start going down, you go in that direction. This is wonderful world. Wonderful world right here. No light in the boom. Wonderful world, and this is another apocalypse. So let's imagine a policymaker. Let's call him P. This is P right here, just a letter. You're on this slope somewhere, right? And you're not necessarily a good-natured person, but not necessarily determined to bring the world to an apocalypse. Actually, you'd probably prefer somewhere closer to the wonderful world if you can possibly. You're dealing with your partners. And there's a range of partners. This side, you have partners who want to engage. On this side, you have partners who want to punish. Why? Well, because you're not such a nice person after all. So there are lots of people out there who want to punish you for whatever it is you're doing. They always want to punish you. Now, if you are looking at the world from, and you're looking at these two sides, punish and engage, you may actually want to engage, but you think, well, if I try to engage with this, then they will think it's because I'm weak. Therefore, those people who are calling for punishing me, they'll think that this is because of them. They have been tough, therefore I have been forced to capitulate. So if you're a P, looking at it from the perspective of rational, really a rational actor theory, you're looking at this, you're thinking, you know what, I will show that I'm actually a tough guy, and I will pursue policies that are tough in order to dissuade these people from punishing me, show that punishing does not work. Move a little bit for P1 now. Okay, what happens at this point is those people who were saying, okay, we have to punish this actor, they're saying, well, wait a second, look, he's really as bad as we were telling you, and even worse. Therefore, we need to punish him some more right here. And those people who were thinking, oh, this is, we should engage, they should also, unless if they keep to their previous position, everybody will say, this are fools. They don't understand who they're dealing with. Therefore, they also have to shift. They have to shift to the right. So the whole spectrum here shifts a little bit. So engagement already over here, right? Engagement is here. Punishment goes over here. So and so on it goes. It goes until we obviously move further and further, and it's a dynamic relationship on two sides. Those people who are saying that we have to punish, they will say, well, we were always right because this actor was originally from the start, from the very first point, he was determined to go down there. He was determined, therefore we were right. And if we only acted earlier, we would have been able to push him back. And those, and of course for them, it's a question then of proving themselves right, justifying their own actions. Although, if you look at it from a slightly different angle, you might say that they have actually contributed to this dynamic of insecurity that led us to where we are today. Okay. How does all of this end? Okay, that's the end of the graph. That's the end of the graph. How does all of this end? Here's where I turn to history, and that would say it ends badly. Change, get rid of X. Different category. Ends badly because the logic of events, when you don't have trust, the logic of events will push you further and further and further towards confrontation until we end up in a nuclear apocalypse. Today we have an active conflict in Ukraine, which is very interesting, very unusual situation. It is a war. It's the first time, I think, since the Cold War, since even during the Cold War, that a major nuclear power is waging a war that it defines as an existential conflict. Now, what does it actually mean? You might say, well, actually, it's not existential. Just making it up. They're just trying to justify, but we don't. That is where the uncertainty lies. We don't know whether it's actually existential for them, or they could actually, well, that is what makes it dangerous. If you go back to Cold War history, you will realize that we have been here before. Both sides can push to the brink until they get so scared of what's out there that they jump back and say, we don't want to go there. We don't want to go there. And then they push back and they try to build up trust. This happened in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you know what? Why this became possible? It is because the publics of both countries, at that time the Soviet Union and the United States, they realized that they don't want to go there. They don't want to go there, and there was actually considerable public support for what we call détente. Now, unfortunately, it actually took a Cuban Missile Crisis to get there. Are we going to go through the same process with Russia or with China? I'm afraid probably we're moving in that direction. It's a very scary thought. It's a very sad thing to say at a peace forum, but that's the reality we're living in. How can we avoid? But I don't know. That's why it's called hope to. I don't have the answer. Thank you.
For those of us who were still waking up, this was definitely a wake-up call, and thank you for walking us through the slippery slope to hell as a first intervention. I hope I will come back to you during the Q&A, but I hope the other three speakers that I'm about to introduce will also give us some reasons for optimism, or some ideas about how to move back up on the slippery slope. But thank you for the provocative intervention. I then move to Stephanie FENKART, who is the director of the International Institute for Peace in Vienna. She brings not only an Austrian perspective, the perspective of a country that remains neutral, a country where debates about leaving neutrality haven't really taken off, from what I understand, but also somebody who knows very well some of the more unstable regions of Europe, particularly the Balkans. So maybe you can help us also contextualize the conflict we're seeing, and maybe give us a little bit more of optimism than what we have heard so far. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emiliano. I'm not sure if I will be able to give an optimist outlook, but I will give it a try, though. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I think it is super important that we talk about peace these days, because I must say it has, at least in my career, and I work in peace building more or less in the last 12 years, it has never been that difficult to talk about peace as it is right now. So what is happening is that I have the feeling it is very difficult for political stakeholders, but also for peace builders to understand the whole complexity of the wars and what goes along with it. So what are we witnessing right now is after the attack on Ukraine, we do witness a militarization and rearmament in an unprecedented way, as Emiliano already mentioned. So what we need to understand is that the conflict obviously did not start last year. So why did we only now come up with thinking about what we need to do right now? We need to understand that the war is fought on all fronts. It's not only on the battleground. We do also face a war of propaganda. We do face a war on infrastructure. The war even goes up to the sky. So it makes it very, very difficult to talk about origins, to talk about the different aspects of the war, which is, of course, between Russia and the US on the one hand. It is, of course, between Russia and Ukraine for also this different narrative, historical narrative, which Russia is trying to implement not only recently, but especially since Putin's speech last year. And of course, there are also differences within Ukraine, dividing lines between East and West, which obviously have determined in different ways now since the war started last year. So everything, like all these issues, make it very, very difficult to come to terms and also to address issues without being one-sided. So what I mean by this is that it is also difficult for people talking about peace in the sense of calling for negotiations. I would say everyone is in favor of negotiations. If Zelensky and Putin would say tomorrow, oh, we want to negotiate, I think everyone would be in favor for that. So what is happening, unfortunately, right now is that many people do not also understand, who are calling for it right now, not understand that the timing might not be there. Why is this the case? Because both Ukraine and Russia still think that they can win on the battlefield. And I think this is very, very problematic, and we need to face the situation as it is. So we need to understand the dilemmas, that there is no negotiation possible right now because of, as I said, people think they will win on the battlefield, and there is no trust in general. We do face the securitization, the militarization, but we also need to ask ourselves that if we only focus on security and armament, if this really will bring long-lasting peace. And I'm not really sure, because yesterday we also talked about human security and all the different aspects which come along. We do think, we also need to think about the danger of escalation, which is not very comfortable when we talk about, as you mentioned, a nuclear state, which is now raging this war in Ukraine. So this is another thing which makes it very, very difficult. And of course, also we need to ask, and the peace camp also needs to ask itself the question, what would it mean, for example, if we call, I mean, in the German-speaking sphere, we have many people advocating for peace, that they ask for the stop of delivery of weapons, and immediately people would say, yes, of course, stop the delivery of weapons, so no one will die. But we need also to ask ourselves, what would that mean? What would that mean if Russia is successful, of course, with its strategy? What would that mean for the Baltics? What would that mean for European security in general? I would like to talk a little bit about the European Union, and I think this is very important. I'm not talking about NATO because, as you mentioned, I come from Austria. We are a neutral state. So the European Union has been a very important success story. It is a peace union, and I have the feeling we tend to forget about this. War was normality in Europe until the European Union was built. We saw this very, very impressive unity after the war last year. By the way, not in 2014. There was kind of unity, but not in the same sense. So we saw this unity in the way that we all came along with sanctions, and something very important also happened. We granted candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova, and I have been working on the Western Balkans for many years, and believe me, I did not see that coming a year before. It is really something very, very new, and I also think it is important for us to take this credibly, so that is on the European Union. The biggest success I mentioned was no war, it was a peace union, but I also think that it is very important for the European Union to be credible when it comes to its values. I do have the feeling that also the European Union tends to forget that it is founded on the values. It's Article 2, it's not just a buzzword, it is actually there. The European Union is founded on its values. So we need to be credible, not only in Ukraine, but also in other regions. And this is, of course, where the Western Balkans also come in. So the European Union has made its promises, but it didn't manage to deliver there. I think it is very important also to address the situation within the European Union with all the situations we are facing with Brexit, democratic backsliding in Poland, and wherever. It still has a transformative power, but we need to come back to it and think about it as well. So the war is very complex, so we need also very complex strategies, and we also need to understand that the European Union is not an island in general. We do know that the United Nations, I mean, there is a resolution, I think 141 states condemned the Russian attack on Ukraine, which is the majority, but many, many major powers did not. We need to understand this. I think it's very important. It's not China, even though I hear that China might be making a move towards calling it also an aggression when it comes to Georgia. So maybe China might shift. And I think this is also, we need to grasp what is possible without saying we cannot even talk about China, and China cannot and should not play a role. Maybe we need to think about what China's interests could be. So in the sense that we need to stick to our values and our cooperation with China. We need to cooperate where possible. We need to stick to our values also when we deal with China. But we don't need to dismiss it in general. In general, we need to be cautious, but also to look, for example, at the 12 points plan. When China came up with this plan, you would hear immediately, oh, it's not worth even the paper what it is written upon. But if you read it, there are some good things written in there as well, especially when it comes to the nuclear escalation, when it comes to situation on the field, the exchange of war prisoners, etc. So we need to be cautious, but not dismiss it in general, and see maybe we can bring China on board to put some pressure on Russia. And I think this is important because I think we need to find a way to put pressure on Russia. I understand that it's difficult for Zelensky in Ukraine, and it is very, very also from our moral point of view difficult to push on Ukraine. But why do we not talk about pushing more on Russia? And that is also my criticism when it comes to the peace camp, especially in the German-speaking countries, those who are calling for the end of delivery of weapons. I would like to hear them also to call on Russia to get out of Ukraine, because we cannot and we should not forget that the war obviously is on Ukrainian territory and it is not on Russian territory. So, however, what we are dealing with is something else. That we also need to be self-critical. The European Union needs to be self-critical also when it comes to what it is possible to do, but also when it comes to past experiences. I mentioned the Western Balkans, when it comes to credibility, but also when it comes to how we look at conflicts. The war didn't start in 2022, it started in 2014. Wasn't there anything more possible to do in that case? I think we need to pose these tough questions. If we want wars not to happen again in Europe, we do need to think beyond deterrence. I think that is very important. Deterrence, I think it is a thing which is important. We understand this, especially now when the war came back. But we need to think beyond deterrence, and we need to think what organization could come in. The OSCE, I think we will hear more about it later. The OSCE tried to build something like cooperative security. It is highly politicized these days. There is no dialogue happening. So it is in a very, very difficult situation. The United Nations, the same page, more or less. The Security Council is paralyzed. So we cannot expect wonders from the Security Council as well. However, I do think still that we need to put human security into the focus. We need to come back to think about other conflicts as well, which is not easy as well, because the world is so complex. We have many different conflicts. I mean, there is a very, very concerning situation in Sudan. So this whole complexity of the situation we are facing doesn't really make it easy, but I do think we also need not to forget about peace, in the sense of that we need also to work for peace in peaceful times. And I think this is something we tend to forget a lot, and we just start reacting. And what we are doing right now is reacting. It is like exactly what you have been mentioning right now with the states. It's, oh, we already told you. Those are the bads, and now we are right, so we need to push more for that. We need really to think, to have a complex idea about which future we want to live in and how we go there. Yes, Maybe one more thing is also obviously the longer the war takes, the more difficult it is to get out of it, and the more necessary it is, though, to talk about peace. I think we need to talk about peace, understanding complexities, and also understanding limits of it. I leave it already here, but yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, for touching upon a number of relevant aspects to our discussion, and for raising also some of the sensitive and controversial issues in the debate we are having about the war, including your observation that the parties to the conflict continue to believe that there can be a solution on the battlefield, and how, probably short-sighted that idea is. At the same time, and I say it without any pleasure, we have been repeating when it comes to a number of conflicts that there are no military solutions to them. But we have seen, in fact, if you look at the Middle East, if you look at the case of Syria, pretty successful examples of conflicts being repressed, not solved, but repressed with military force. And that's why I brought up in my introductory remarks the idea that we also need to move beyond just talking about peace in general terms, because if peace is just a sort of absence of active conflict, right, and if it's a peace that is not based on principles, it's not fair, it may still not work. It may still actually be something detrimental. But thank you for all the stimulating points, and the fact that you already touched upon the situation in the Balkans, which I think will be at the center of Ivan VEJVODA's remarks. Ivan is a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, also in Vienna. He's an expert on the Balkans. Ivan, you have 5 to 7 minutes as the head of a project that is dealing with Europe's future. I'm sure, futures, plural. I'm sure you have also debated the question of the future of European peace. So the floor is yours. We all look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Emiliano, and thank you to the Agency for Peacebuilding. It's a real honor to be here. I am, fortunately or unfortunately, I think one of the rare people in this room who has gone through war. My country, that no longer exists, called Yugoslavia, imploded. It's usually referred to as Balkan Wars, which is not exactly true because it's one country in the Balkans called Yugoslavia that went to war with itself. And it ended up with a bombing by NATO. And I was in Belgrade with my family, 78 days under bombs. Wasn't a very pleasant experience. I wouldn't wish it to anyone. NATO also bombed civil infrastructure, electricity grids. It used cluster bombs. It used depleted uranium bombs. And so there's nothing nice about war, frankly, and there's a whole history. You don't need to go to the Museo della Storia di Bologna at Palazzo Pepoli, which I did yesterday, to remind yourself that the history of this city, like many others, is littered with war and conflicts, internal and external. It's no surprise that Machiavelli wrote Dell'arte della guerra, or that Hegel says that war is a positive moment wherein the state asserts itself as an individual establishing its rights and interests. So the history of the world is a history of war, but we have the counterpoint of the European Union. It is, as Stephanie said, the most successful peace project, and we all want to join it. In fact, all of the Balkan countries, the Western Balkan countries, want to join. Some have joined, some haven't yet, because I think as we talk about peace, what is it that secures the stability of peace? One usually says that democracies don't go to war, and there was even a more far-fetched that countries that have the golden arches of McDonald's don't go to war. In fact, it was during the bombing that another McDonald's was being opened in Belgrade, which was quite an incredible thing to watch. So I would say that, you know, the question, I think the fundamental question is, and Ukraine is an example, when somebody comes to your home and wants to take over your living room, you do one of two things. Either you fight back because you don't want to give up your living room, or you surrender. For example, like France did to Hitler in 1941 after La Drôle de Guerre. And these are the two extremes. And my country, we were brought up because there was a big partisan war during the Second World War. We would fight back. I wouldn't want to give up my living room, whatever it cost. And we were, as Yugoslavia in the 70s, under the threat that the Soviet Union might attack. And in fact, when one talks about 70 years of peace in Europe, one talks about Western Europe, because the Soviet Union invaded Hungary in 56, invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, and so there has been war. And of course, the Ukraine is the biggest, the Russian invasion is the biggest war in Europe, but there was this Yugoslav war in between. And so peace did come in the end, and there are various reasons, either because of exhaustion, people can't do it, or you are defeated. As Emiliano just said, you know, there's a bigger power, and Milosevic did the foolish thing to go to war with NATO, even though he was warned by his generals not to do this. And of course, when you go to war with a power and you are defeated, you lose territory, and that was the case of Kosovo. Kosovo is de facto independent, or it is not de jure independent because the UN Security Council says it isn't. And so we are seeking this road to peace between and solving a problem that we have between Serbia and Kosovo, which is usually the case after wars. It's over territory. You know, some call it frozen conflicts, others active or not. And of course, we'll hear from Vlad, who is here next to me, about one such case. The two leaders met in Brussels yesterday. Again, Europe is the one that is fostering the attempt to find the peace. They reached an agreement on missing persons finally, because there are still hundreds and several thousand people who are not accounted for on both sides, both Serbs and Albanians. And so the road to peace is slow, and a British political theorist and scientist, Bernard Crick, who wrote a wonderful book called In Defense of Politics, wrote a concluding additional chapter on the high price of peace. You have to give up some things to reach a peace when it is these two sides. it's compromise. You have to give up on your maximalist demands and find that middle ground between the two sides where no one will be happy but not totally dissatisfied, so that people can go back home and say, okay, and everyone will declare victory, of course, because that's what politicians do. I mention this because I think a key aspect in this is politics and democratic institutions. Countries that have democratic institutions, checks and balances, don't go to war, because there is this check and balance. It is authoritarian countries, ones that want to dominate, and that's what Machiavelli says in L'arte della guerra. He says, you know, people are egotistical and they would go to war to dominate. And I think that's what we're seeing with Russia and Putin. Sun Tzu says, well, you fight wars out of necessity, and that's what Ukraine is doing, simply defending itself from a nuclear power that has attacked it. So I'm reaching in 30 seconds by 7 minutes. So I will end with Machiavelli. I'm a political theorist, as you can imagine. And Machiavelli talked about fortuna and virtù. And I think that's really the essence of what we're discussing here. There are the winds of fortuna, of destiny, of fate, that are baffling you and sending you somewhere. But we have virtù. We have the virtues. We have the capacity to maybe steer the ways in which we go forward. And this is, of course, the difficulty and beauty of it, because we are the ones who decide, or rather the P people that Sergey talked about. They are the ones who decide in our name. In a democratic country, we have elected them. In an authoritarian one, they impose themselves. You know, Putin has been in power forever, basically. We had one such leader. We got rid of him. And so the civic element is so important. La vita civile, which is so crucial in Machiavelli's view, but also for us. So what do we citizens, how do we fight back against someone like that? In my former country, it took us 10 years to gather our energies to fight back and finally defeat the bad regime that went to war in an election. And during the bombing, and I end on this, we were a group of 30 people, small, but it's usually like that made an appeal. It was dangerous to ask for a return to a democratic peace-seeking, diplomatic peace-seeking avenues. We were under attack, but in the end, that appeal, with the various combinations that I talked about, led, in fact, to the end of the war. So I think it's relevant, and that is my key point, that politics and civic resilience and civic energy is crucial. It's not only to be left to politicians and military leaders. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ivan, for the very insightful presentation. And I was thinking about what you said, the role of institutions, the role of integration more broadly, and something that I think has inspired all of us about the fight Ukraine finds itself in is that they are, even as they pursue, Stephanie, their military goals, and they're very much focused on those right now, but they have linked their cause to the aspiration to become a member of the European Union. The European Union flag flies on buildings across Ukraine. So even as they have come under attack, and their immediate goal is to get back their living room and more, they still, I think, have this very clear view that peace will never take roots, even if they achieve it, if Ukraine remains outside of the larger European family and the institutions we have all built. And our final speaker, Professor LISENCO, Vlada, from the University of Tiraspol, may probably also give us some insight into what is happening in Moldova, a country in which the European Union is more and more active, at the same time a country that has been rumored a number of times for possibly being involved in the ongoing conflict, not just as a recipient of Ukrainian refugees but also because of the dynamics that have been playing out in that country for many years. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's also a great honor to be among so distinguished experts and distinguished auditorium, and the topic is really very important. And I'm from Moldova, the country who is a candidate to European Union, and as moderator said, that we have ongoing conflict which already 33 years old, and I'm a lawyer by my background, and we're very much actively working on the level of NGO level, grassroots level. I'm also teaching in the university, and I'm more focused as a lawyer to the aspects of human rights in de facto states, which is a really very serious and very complicated, I could say, story, because the people who are living, for example, in Transnistrian region, they have up to 3 or 4 passports, just in case, who knows what part of territory of or country this territory will be, which is not really funny and not really good case. But anyway, I will speak about maybe Transnistria just to answer to a question, but some of my ideas, I'm more optimist in general by my own, and I would like just to think about the role of international organizations in Moldova, but in general. And of course, I would like to state that we live in the world of multiply complex global challenges, but as Antonio Guterres, General Secretary of UN, said that moments of great difficulties are also moments of great opportunities. So I think that maybe this kind of difficulties also is a time to come together in solidarity and to unite a solution that could benefit all people. And as Francis Fukuyama mostly proclaimed, that end of the Cold War marked the end of the history with liberal democratic democracy over competing ideologies. But of course it was believed that 21st century will be a time as a post-conflict globalized society with peace and prosperity. But unfortunately still we have this terrorism, civic wars, these special operations with a lot of loss of lives each year. And there are so many ongoing conflicts still exist. It's more than 32 different conflicts ongoing now. And of course, the major global issues it was pandemic. Now it is Ukrainian war, and war in Ukraine. Of course, it has a very great impact of neighborhood countries, like, for example, Moldova. In European Union, it's more than 8 million refugees. In Moldova, it's up to 500,000. In Transnistrian region, it is around 50,000. So Transnistria is between Ukraine and Moldova. So even in the conflict area, there are around 50,000 refugees there. And of course, conflict in general is depending not Ukraine and or any conflict has, of course, a very negative consequences on infrastructure, on public health, on social order. Of course, it's illness, it's displacement of people, destruction of the environment, so many, of course, negative consequences. And according to the peace agenda, of course, so many states should decrease their war budgets. But as we see, for example, Ukrainian war forced many countries to increase their, as we see, defense spending. For example, Germany, I read, already taking important new measures in this area with 100 billion additional defense spending last year. So it's about 2% of GDP. And European Defense Agency marked that it is about 6% of all budgets of European countries about defense spending. And about defense research and technologies, it's also the countries raise more than 16% in comparison with last year, totally about 50 billion. So it's a very huge amount of money. And as about, let's say, different international organizations like UN and OEC, of course, it is I think this organization, I believe in the power of these international organizations. OEC mission in Moldova, for example, is already 30 years, and there is a format of 5+2 where Ukraine and Russia, OEC, and Transnistria and Moldova as a mediator in the conflict, and the European Union and America as observers. Of course, it was very different stages of successes, but unfortunately, there is no, I don't see the vision of to complete this Transnistrian conflict, for example, in case of Moldova. Yes, there are some 12 working groups in different areas. There are different interesting scenarios of Transnistrian conflict, for example, but unfortunately nothing take place in Transnistria and in Moldova. Unfortunately, the conflicts still exist, and unfortunately it's very much influenced. Moreover, after Ukrainian crisis, of course, Transnistria was in the top of agenda, I could say, because it's during more than a year, everyone is waiting, let's say, or Ukrainians troops are coming to the territory of, let's say, de facto Transnistria, de jure Moldova, or it will be peacekeeping troops which are on the Transnistrian territory will be more active. So, of course, situation is very difficult, but OEC and UN institutions or instruments, I think they are the only one, I think, in this region, in Moldova, of course, and the European Union is very active. European Union also supported so many projects in peace building, in peacekeeping, and it is very active also, for example, in Moldova. As about United Nations, there is a peace agenda, there is a sustainable development goals, and the most important, as you know, is 16 and 17 sustainable development goal, which is about peace, about partnerships. And as we see about peace agenda for this year and next year, it will be an important forum in UN. It will be a future forum for the next year. It will be a summit on global economy, World Social Summit, and all these events and all activities, I could say, of institution of UN, of international organization, they are more moving to develop a common agenda, which was in 2021 it was proposed by Secretary General. So of course I see instruments of international organization for the future as a good tool, let's say, to resolve international conflicts, to pay attention to different, but of course the most important is also to make different activities on the grassroots level. In this regard, of course, NGO, non-government organizations will play a very crucial role also in peace building and in peacekeeping. And yesterday it was a very great report which Bernardo made, Italy and the Triple Nexus. And of course, this is a very serious material, let's say, for different actors to research. And as yesterday somebody said that it could be a skill nexus as a Italian NGOs, Italian think tanks, experts could be a very serious background for the expertise for, let's say, countries like from Eastern Partnership area, to be some kind of a good methodology to give, to share. And I'm sure that, let's say, this kind of cooperation on different areas, education, NGO level, this kind of different, let's say, instruments on different, let's say, levels could be a very serious, let's say, step forward to come closer, let's say, to peaceful way of negotiation or to decide the conflicts in Transnistrian conflicts or Ukrainian conflicts. I think that I could stop on this, and of course I will be ready to answer to more specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vlad, and thank you so much for mentioning some of these organizations that, of course, have been challenged by developments on the ground in Ukraine and beyond, but they still remain useful. They are resilient. They're changing. So I think during the Q&A we'll have some of this discussion about how the EU itself is changing, becoming on the one hand a more capable security actor in its own right, but also accelerating a process of enlargement that had been stalling for some time. If there are no reactions from the speakers to other speakers' comments, I would open up the floor for questions. We have less than 30 minutes before the panel finishes. Please raise your hands. Yes, and introduce yourself. I think you will be given a microphone. We already have a couple of people. Yeah, please.
Hi, good morning. My name is Anna Cervi, and I've been working in the humanitarian sector for the last 15 years, and in countries that are unfortunately still at war. Sudan, Afghanistan, Syria are some examples. And I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that were said by the speakers and ask a question. Stephanie mentioned about perspective on European Union from other countries that are not just those in the European Union and are not just those involved in the current conflict in Ukraine. And my question is there a reflection and a realization that while the European Union represents a core set of values, at the same time has been is unable to actually keep the credibility it used to have for countries that are, for instance, in the Middle East or in East Asia. So is there a discussion on this? Is there a self-reflection? And is there some level of thinking on how to engage or re-engage with those realities? And then the other observation is on picking up of what Ivan was saying. For someone that has lived under war, in war, and that's not me as a citizen of those countries, but yes, absence of active conflict is not peace, but without the stopping of the conflict, there is nothing really that can happen to move on and have those dialogues of reconciliations that will take years. Is there a realization that that is actually something that is of essence for civilians, not just in terms of saving lives, but also in terms of fostering further dialogue between unreconciled visions on the country? And so, thank you very much. Sorry, it took a little bit of time.
Thank you for your question. Bernardo, if you want to also ask your question, we take a couple of them or even three. Is anyone else?
Thank you. My name is Bernardo Mozzani. I'm the president of the Agency for Peacebuilding. I was wondering if I could ask for I guess, a reflection from the panelists about the word that comes to mind is resistance, like civil resistance. There are narratives about the conflict, the ongoing conflict. There are, of course, political agendas that are being pushed by political actors. But there are also others who are not in political positions who are offering alternatives to the decisions that are being taken. And I was wondering, both in the current context, but as well perhaps with a historical reflection, what is the role that we can expect this alternative voices, or at least these voices providing alternative solutions or ideas about the war? Do they have any role to play? Can they play a role? In that case, are there any indications from history about what that may be? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's maybe stop here for now and go back to the speakers in reverse order. So if Vlada, you want to go first and respond to some of these comments or questions. If you want to pass on this, no problem.
But maybe just
Yes.
to react to Bernardo's question about alternative voices on like political agenda for politicians and alternative voices, it will be good that it will be natural, let's say, good nature where these voices could be really listened. I speak about more democratic societies. So in case if sometimes the conflict take place in the territory where there is no freedom of media, there is no freedom of voices, and it is a huge attempts NGO level, and it should be, of course, a political decision to make this kind of environment with a good, spreading of different values and opportunities of grassroots level to be a part of this, comprehensive negotiation process in general. So, for example, in our case, like in Moldova, where I live, we are doing our best to open as much as we can the window of opportunity for alternative voices on different levels, on trying to democratize the whole, let's say, situation, for example, in our case.
And before going to Ivan, thinking about the conflict in Ukraine, I think we are all unhappy for now, for the lack of better terms, about the insufficient role that civil society at large is playing. There are some very active NGOs in Ukraine that are doing a fantastic job and keeping a debate alive and helping the authorities in this difficult time. But we could, of course, hope for much more. I know that Stephanie was discussing a while ago, the role that a dialogue between dissidents, from Russia or people who have left the country, dialogue between them and Ukrainian NGOs representing Ukrainian society could have in sort of laying out the foundations for a different type of relationship altogether. But because we are in the middle of the conflict, some of these things are seen as problematic, or at least they're not seen as a priority right now. So maybe you can comment also about those, but I go to Ivan first. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I think the two questions are related. I mean, alternative voices are key, and especially as the war is raging. I mean, you take Antonio Spinelli, right? He was thinking, and many Europeans were thinking, in the midst of the raging war, what would happen after, and how do we try to avoid a future conflict, and how do we create the stable foundations of peace? And thus your question about, fostering discussions between unreconciled communities is fundamental. Yeah, the absence of conflict is actually the beginning. And if we're not looking at which is a very long process of looking at what the responsibilities of the communities and societies were in coming to war, we are not really doing the work. And you look at post-war Germany or post-war Japan, post-war Japan still has a way to go. I think Germany has been doing it. If you look, there is the monument to the Holocaust in central Berlin, but that was only 50 years after World War II. So these things take time, and they have to take. They need to happen at various levels. Obviously, politicians need to do their apologies and all that, but society has to do work with itself and to recognize this is where education is fundamental. If people are not learning what their leaders did and what crimes they committed and what is their responsibility, we're not getting anywhere. And I think that in the case of former Yugoslavia, there have been things that have been done. This is where civic activists have really done the work. For example, in Serbia, we had a book in the middle of the war about the Serbian responsibility for the war that looked at the responsibility of journalists, of politicians, of the church, the military, of people, intellectuals. So it is fundamental. And I think that, to go back to the alternative voices, however weak they may seem at a certain point to some, they are fundamental. And I'm thinking, of course, of the dissidents in the Soviet Union and in Central and Eastern Europe, the Sakharovs, the Adam Michnik's, the Václav Havels, fundamental for what happened later, because they were creating and thinking of the future. Obviously, we can add peace to that because, as I said, democratic institutions they were thinking of were fundamental then to creating that foundation of stability.
Thank you. Thank you a lot, Ivan. Stephanie?
Okay. Yes. Yes, maybe on the alternative voices as well. Of course, they do exist, but I mean, I must say, and also from our own experience, the situation is very toxic. So it is very, very difficult to bring those people at one table. And we are trying that. I mean, at my institute, we are trying that. We do that in Chatham House rules environment. And there, sometimes it works that we find Ukrainians and Russians sitting together. But that's the only way. And quite honestly, it's not so difficult for the Russians, actually. It's the Ukrainians who do not want it. And it is a very and even though, and I talked to my Ukrainian friends, and I would like them, would you come? Would you sit on a table? Would you discuss? Many of them are like, I would actually like to, but I literally don't dare because of the situation back home. I mean, many of them are men; they cannot leave the country, so they need to live there. They do have their careers, so it is. I think it is enormously important how we are able to create this room where they can sit together in a very safe environment to discuss what they think is needed and how to get out of the situation. I don't really see a lot of room in there, and I mean, even in the civil society sector. So you can imagine how difficult it is for other organizations like OSCE or others. So I think it is very difficult. And that is not only for Russians coming from Russia, but also for civil society Russians in exile. Like even with them, it is difficult. So if you're doing something in public, I mean, it's no problem also to do it in Vienna, to have Russians sitting there, but you wouldn't find Ukrainians sitting there. Maybe another example, there is planned a civil society conference in June in Austria from different angles of civil society, a very pro-peace camp. Some of those, I would say, not really also understanding the complexity of the whole situation. But there are already 20 Ukrainian NGOs who try actually to block this conference for happening. I mean, this is the reality we are facing. So I think it is very importantly that we also need to address this, that we need to discuss, we need to keep dialogue channels somehow open. And I must say it is very unfortunately super difficult. It's a lot more difficult than it was during the Yugoslav wars, I must say, because I know that this happened in Vienna during the hot phase of the conflict still. I don't see this happening at the moment, very, very unfortunately, especially if you consider how close the ties have been before. I mean, we cannot do as if Ukraine's history evolved in a vacuum from the Russian history. That's just not the case. But it's really, I think, relationships are shattered for the next, most probably decades. And this is what we need to go once the war ends, like the hard war ends. We still need to focus on these issues. And maybe it's not talking about the conflict itself, but maybe what our common interests, like talking a little bit more about disarmament. The situation is in dire strait, or is literally, I would say, no more disarmament agreement on the ground, while everyone is militarizing, etc. Like those issues maybe who do not really touch upon the conflict itself, but who share a common interest. I see that could maybe be something where people from those different regions could work together. On the credibility of the European Union, yes, it's exactly, I think the problem is that the European Union, we know 27 member states, we know Brexit, we know Hungary, we know Poland. I do think the focus is a wrong one these days. I mean, we don't, 27 member states, most of them talk about migration and or the war there. So I think we need to be credible again, also when it comes to the region more towards the east. But we don't even manage to be credible close to our borders in the Western Balkans. So this is also why I try to make the point that we need to be credible. We need to also, when we talk about European Union enlargement, it shouldn't be a buzzword. It needs to be something tangible. So I don't know. I mean, I was talking yesterday with even, for example, why not bringing in Montenegro? It's 600,000 inhabitants. I mean, they did reforms. It would be possible also to give an incentive that the process is still ongoing. We do not manage to be credible there. I think it is even more difficult to be credible anywhere elsewhere, very unfortunately. So I think we need to come back to this value aspect, saying again, it's not a buzzword, but it is actually the foundation of the European Union if we want it to survive. Yes, I think, was there?
Thank you, Stephanie and Professor. You know, before you also react to the comments and the questions you heard, because in your initial remarks, you know, you commented on the Cold War and dynamics then. what do you see as the main differences here? Because, Stephanie mentioned one, right? There was an arms control regime, not throughout the Cold War, but throughout, a part of it at least. And that's largely gone. And that's one difference. Civil society, I'm not sure during the Cold War there was a lot of civil society to civil society engagement across the blocks, but everything looks more fluid, if not more chaotic now than in the sort of decades of the Cold War. So please feel free also to address these issues.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll address that, and I'll also react to something that Stephanie just said. Regarding alternative voices, if you go to history of the Cold War, absolutely they mattered. In so many cases, they mattered. I mean, look at for example, U.S. war in Vietnam. Did alternative voices not matter? There was a whole civil society protesting, linking the war to civil rights struggle in the United States, etc. And that had a huge impact on the way that the war unfolded, and particularly American willingness to prosecute this war unfolded in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. Did the civil society not matter during the U.S. British involvement in the war in Iraq? No, of course they mattered. I mean, I remember back in, I think it was in 2003, I was part of a major peace demonstration in London. I think it was the biggest that London had ever seen. And, it made a huge difference because the public debate shifted in the direction of why are we there? Why are we fighting this war? You then focus on Russia and ask the question, well, why isn't there public support again, or public protest against the war? I ask this question to myself all the time. I wonder, because when the war broke out, I personally felt extremely depressed for weeks and weeks and weeks. I could not understand how it could possibly be happening, and yet I saw that there is actually considerable public support. And I think that considerable public support, let's be honest, continues today in across Russia. I think that's because the government was able to win the struggle of narratives. They have tried to present this war as existential, war against the West, as a war for Russia's very survival, and they have a lot of purchase from the public for doing precisely this. In 1991, Russia lost a sense of purpose. The Soviet Union collapsed. The ideology was gone. They didn't know what they had to do in the world. They never developed an idea of where Russia was going. And Emiliano, you mentioned Ukraine, how they are so enthusiastic about joining Europe, joining the European Union, how this is driving the agenda in Kiev. Russia doesn't have this option. They're kind of drifting out there, trying to figure out whether they're Asia or Europe or God knows what else. They don't have a purpose. Because they don't have a purpose, they are extremely gullible when it comes to government presenting them with this dire choice. Either you are with us or Russia, the only thing you have, it will fall apart. And that, I think, is the reason why you do not have much in the way of public voices against the war. But I would not underestimate those voices. I mean, I have been somewhat active in the Russian opposition movement to a certain extent. Certainly, I'm not an activist myself, but I have done certain things, and I see those people out there who, people like Karamurza, who's now serving a 25-year prison sentence for what? For speaking out against the war. There are people like that. I think I would agree with Ivan here that are Sakharovs of today, and they do present roadmap to the future for those Russians who have a conscience, who understand, we have to get out of this situation. And I would very much agree with Stephanie that it's extremely difficult for Russians to find themselves in a room with Ukrainians. I am in a peculiar situation because, I have, obviously, you can tell by my surname that I have some kind of a Ukrainian connection. Obviously, my whole family is from Ukraine, but I grew up at least until age 15. I was in Russia, so I have it from from both sides, so to speak. And for me, it makes no sense. Of course, I want to talk. Of course, I want to hear all kinds of opinions. Try to persuade people. Try to have those conversations. But when we're in a stage of active conflict, it's a question of othering. You have to other. And for Ukrainians, I understand why they want to other Russians, because they still fear somehow that the Europeans who they want to accept them. You know, they want to be accepted by the Europeans. Some of those Europeans will still have in their mind some doubt about Ukrainians, whether they're really Europeans or whether they're Russians or something like that. You know what I mean? So there's this fear by Ukraine that it will be rejected, and they need to assert themselves by basically saying, no, we're just not them. We're different. We don't want to talk to them. We're not even, we should not be sitting in the same room. How do you overcome this? I'm glad that you have those initiatives to try to bring, you know, people together. I think this is fantastic. But with regard, Emiliano, to your final question, was there contact between the sides during the Cold War? Absolutely, there was a lot more contact, I think, at some level than there is now, because you could actually have track 1.5 dialogue, and this was actually an ongoing thing. And we were not afraid to speak to the other side during the Cold War. You know what this actually, where we are today, you know what this reminds me of most during the Cold War? It was the conflict between the Soviet Union and China. Because during the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese seemed so crazy, nobody wanted to talk to them. And also, they did not want to talk to anybody. So there was this active phase in the late 1960s where China seemed to be going totally off the rails, and people were thinking, "Oh my God, what is this?" You know, it seemed, and even at that time, Moscow was trying to other China, saying, "Oh, they say they're communists, but they're not communists. That's not what communism is." You know, so I think we are in this phase at the moment where even a dialogue with Russia seems to be politically unacceptable, and a lot of people. And there was somebody recently who called for moral cleansing. So let's have a moral cleansing here in the West of those people who try to have dialogue with Russia, because no, you're not supposed to have dialogue with them. I am, as it happens, I'm against this position. Yeah, I think even at the time of conflict, even if you're in the Cultural Revolution or in conflict with China or whatever, you still have to find room for conversation, because not to is irresponsible. We are living in a different world today. This is where Ivan was talking about compromise. Absolutely. During the Second World War, you could fight all the way to the bitter end and say, okay, full capitulation and so on. We're not in this world anymore, because nuclear weapons make for world of a difference. This is the impact of nuclear revolution that happened in the 1950s, and we're living with it. So therefore, we have to be aware of it, but a lot of people are not.
Thanks a lot for these insights. And this is not only an extremely interesting conference, but a forum. I just wanted to take a minute for self-reflection. Since, you know, we are the forum of people in Italy that chose peace building as a field of studies, of action, of analysis. So I think, you know, we all have the responsibility to be those stakeholders in the upper part of the slippery slope that do not accept going down, that still want to engage up there in spite of the situation deteriorating. So it's up to us to show that peace building options are numerous and always possible. And just as an example, with my friend Laura from Patrir, we've been managing a small peace building project. We received very little funding for peace building engagement in Ukraine. But we had Ukrainian partners that were willing to build a training curricula and courses on peace education in Ukrainian schools. We had the Minister of Education in the end accepting it as an interesting material to be multiplied. There is a lot that can be done in Ukraine, and there is so little investment on it. Why? Because probably, you know, of course, this is not our responsibility. Have the power to make policymakers and international donors understand that this is doable, and it makes a lot of sense precisely because of the reasons you were explaining, you know, and the importance of civic action. We need to tell that those 100,000 people marching in Rome last year against the war in Ukraine, they were mainly criticizing the Russian aggression. Almost all of them, we were there, almost all of them. Overwhelming majority, they were criticizing the Russian aggression, but then we were asking our politicians to develop peaceful ways for peace, to invest on disarmament, on civic action. And then I also have a question, which is, I confirm also, our Ukrainian partners are telling us here the problem is lack of trust. We don't trust the Russians. So any agreement that can be reached will not be respected, And then in order to work on, building trust, why isn't the international community discussing more the possibility of having peacekeeping forces, civilian peace builders, in any area where an agreement is reached? Why is this totally out of the conversation? Thank you.
For the comment and the question. And here, Mikhail, there's very last question.
Maybe connected, not really connected with what you just, but like forcing parties to negotiate implies that pressure. And one has been the ICC. Of course, I'm sure you all know that the South African president said Putin won't be allowed to come to BRICS summit virtually, otherwise you will be arrested. So can you please comment on this, or what do you think? Like, national stance, is it helpful? Is it not helpful? Because at the end of the day, for Putin, heresy, and is it working? Do you think this is a way, like a non-violent way for peace, or at least try to force the negotiation table, or is this, as some people say, manipulating international or let's say police? I think the ICC would one. It's been trying to be, but just what do you think about this?
Very clear. Yeah, maybe one more over there.
The question: are there measures of assessment in international law or in international relations or in international area? I'm Albanian. I come from the civic war, so I really know what does war mean itself, not only for Albanian people in Albania, but also for Kosovo in in the upper part of Albania. And I know that an internal problem is completely different from an external problem. So I have two perspectives. Thus, I think in peace building, we must think in terms of assessment. Assess the manipulation, because it's very, very specific, the problem. We can say Putin has problems. Do you know where are you going to? But we are not solving the problem. So how to solve the international problem between Ukraine and Russia, and how to assess the manipulation of information. It's very important.
Thank you. And because it's already 11:15, I would ask our speakers to only respond to those questions that they think are relevant to their expertise as briefly as possible. I don't know, Stephanie, you want to go first?
Maybe very briefly on the ICC, I would say very problematic. I would say we see a crisis of multilateralism in general, and the ICC is no exception of it. Ukraine was not part of the ICC until 2014. Then they said, okay, now we are facing this Russian aggression, so now we put ourselves under the jurisdiction. Russia is not part of the ICC. The US is not part of the ICC. So this is part of the big problem, of course, with institutions like this, and I think we need to foster towards why is any country saying we are not going to be part of an international criminal court, which is actually only targeting the most serious crimes. I think this is the problem we are facing in general when it comes to this whole value debate, and this is also when it comes to credibility, what I tried to make the point before. So I wouldn't say, you can interpret it in all different ways, if it was good or not. I think there are many things in favor of it. Also, it's also a signal, but of course, there's also the other side of it, to making the whole ICC and less important institution in general. So it is a very, very difficult and tense situation in this context. I don't remember the other question I have. Yeah. Shall I leave it with that? Yeah. I wanted to say very briefly just before on the public support in Russia when it comes to the war, because I think this is another very important topic, because it is obviously true. I'm not saying it is not, but this we need to understand that Russia does not really have this kind of civil society. They're under a lot of pressure. There is no press freedom, not recently, but that already started when Putin, like in the first Chechnya wars. So when he actually limited the access to public opinion and all those issues. So the public support is there, but it also depends on how would you ask the population there. So if you, for example, because I was discussing this with a Russian sociologist just a couple of months ago or weeks ago, when he said it depends on how you ask the question. If you ask them, are you Putin is doing this war, are you in favor of it? They say yes. But if you ask them if Putin stops the war tomorrow, are you in favor of this? They will also say yes. So it's not this enthusiastic approach towards this war. And why is that? It's more or less, they don't really care so much about it because it is not happening in Russia. We need to understand it. It's not an everyday issue for Russians these days. This is also what TV Rain and Memorial are trying, all of them in exile. They are trying now to bring, their target group is within Russia. So this is very important also, that we support those TV stations or whatever who are outside of Russia, but who still have some audience within, because it is very difficult to enter into this Russian debate. This is just, it's very difficult in autocratic systems to talk about public opinion in general. Just, sorry.
Thank you a lot. Are there any other reactions, answers to the questions? Ivan, yeah.
Yeah, just very briefly on the International Criminal Court. I think it's an important initiative with all of its imperfections. Stephanie said what the problem was. So the similar case of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, very important. Nobody was happy with it. Lots of imperfections, but without it, I think it would have been much worse.
So it was a challenging panel, as I said at the beginning, but I think we provided some interesting perspectives and some also possible solutions, also thanks to a very active audience that not only put questions to the speaker, but also shared important and promising experiences. We finish here. There's going to be a panel in just half an hour on conflict beyond Europe and the role of Europe in trying to mitigate or even solve those conflicts. So that's the plan for the morning. Thank you so much for listening to us, and thank you for the speakers for all your insight.